We have a bulletin just received.
I've never encountered anything like this world.
Using Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Illustrator together. If you feel that you need a review of Photoshop or Illustrator basics, you can review the instruction videos from our first semester digital color class. This video is a quick tutorial about using Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Illustrator together. Using Photoshop and Illustrator together is really easy and convenient, and pretty much necessary for completing your first project. Even though Photoshop is pixel-based and Illustrator is vector-based, Photoshop does have vector tools like the vector shape tools, also the type tool when you make text in Photoshop, that's vector-based and creates its own special type layer that's vector-based. Even though Photoshop has vector tools, the vector tools are much more versatile and numerous in Illustrator. When I'm working, I usually leave both Photoshop and Illustrator open and just use whichever one is better suited for a particular job. I just drag stuff back and forth between Photoshop and Illustrator. Illustrator also has pixel-based features like pixel-based filters, even though it's a vector-based program. Placing Adobe Illustrator elements into Adobe Photoshop. There are several different ways to place Illustrator elements into Photoshop. One of the easiest and most flexible ways to place Illustrator elements into Photoshop is to simply have both documents open at the same time, this one in Illustrator and this one in Photoshop, and just select elements and drag them over. Whenever you drag an element over from Illustrator into Photoshop, it automatically creates its own vector layer, vector smart object here. And if we go to Illustrator and we select more than one object, or select all and drag it over, then all of those objects are dragged over and are placed on a single layer. So when you're placing Illustrator objects into Photoshop, you drag it over and it creates a new Vector Smart Object layer. You have to click on the check mark to place your vector layer. So if you want to have the maximum flexibility when you're placing elements from Illustrator into Photoshop, you might want to select individual elements or some elements but not all and drag them over, and that way they're on a single layer. Then select other elements that you'd like to manipulate separately and then drag those over in a separate effort and make it a separate layer. So I'm getting rid of that layer. And a second easy way to do it would be to select elements that you want to place and just do copy or Command C on the keyboard. Then go over here and paste or Command V on the keyboard. Smart object, OK, and there it is. So in some cases that's easier than trying to see both documents and dragging it over. And I hit the check mark. So now I have my Vector Smart Object layer. Other ways you can do it, you can take the actual document icon from wherever you stored it and drag it right on to your piece, and you hit OK. And now it's a Vector Smart Object. When you drag the file icon right into the document, you pretty much are placing whatever is in it, all of the elements, rather than just some of the elements that you select, into your piece, all in one layer. So doing this lacks some versatility. You only want to do this if you want to place all of your Illustrator elements into a single layer in your Photoshop document. And then finally you can do something similar to dragging the icon in and placing the entire Illustrator file into your Photoshop document by going to File, Place, Embedded, and I'll explain what the difference is between embedded and linked in a second. And then you would pick the image and it would place your entire Illustrator document into Photoshop. So what's the difference between placing an embedded file and a linked file? If you place an embedded file, that means it becomes part of your Photoshop document and it's independent of the original Illustrator file. If you place a linked file, then it's following a link back to your original Illustrator file. So the disadvantage of a linked file would be if you didn't have your original Illustrator file with you, then you wouldn't have the information in the Photoshop file anymore. The advantage of a linked file would be you could go back into Illustrator and make changes to that file, and then those changes would automatically update and be reflected in the Photoshop file. For our purposes, for this project, since you're combining so many different elements and doing different things to them, you'll probably want to place embedded and make it a part of the Photoshop document. So again, I'd say my favorite way and the most versatile way is probably just to select elements that you want to have on a single layer inside of Illustrator and then just drag them right over into Photoshop. And remember, whatever you select and drag over will become one single merged layer in Photoshop. So whatever elements you want to keep separate from your Illustrator document, just select those and drag them over separately, or copy and paste. And every time you do that, Photoshop adds an automatic Smart Object layer, a vector layer. Smart Objects. So when you have a Smart Object layer, you'll know it's a Smart Object by seeing this little square in the lower right-hand corner right here. So the advantage of the Smart Object is essentially it remembers the characteristics of the original state of the object. So for instance, in Photoshop, if you were to take a pixel-based image and scale it down, then you lose that resolution. You lose those pixels because now it has fewer pixels because it's smaller. But the Smart Object, if you scale it down and change your mind, you can scale it back up and it'll still remember all of the pixels that it had originally. So it has some virtual qualities and you can use that to experiment. You can also make any pixel-based image into a Smart Object as well. Layer, Smart Object, convert to Smart Object. Now you see that square on the pixel-based figure, right? So now it's a Smart Object. So when you've created a Smart Object, it still remembers the original characteristics, and scale is a big one. So for instance, you could try reducing the size of this object and you could rescale it lots of times without losing any quality because it's still referring to the original file, the original state that the piece was in. So whenever you have a Smart Object like this, there are certain things you can't do because they're not literally pixels yet. You couldn't make a simple selection with the lasso tool, although you could make a layer mask. But when you have just the lasso tool like this, and I'm hitting the delete button, delete, I get a warning, could not complete your request because the Smart Object is not directly editable. Okay, so I will deselect the lasso. If I use the eraser tool, for instance, I have the little Ghostbusters no sign, can't erase, must be rasterized before proceeding. Anytime you want to convert your vector Smart Object into pixels in order to combine them with Photoshop pixel-based elements or manipulate them in certain ways, then what you want to do is select that layer, the Smart Object layer, and go to Layer, Rasterize, and you can choose Smart Object or Layer. If you choose all layers, it'll rasterize all of your layers all at once. But let's just do Layer. And you'll notice the square disappears. So this is no longer a vector Smart Object, now it's pixels. And it can be manipulated just like any other pixels in Photoshop. So whenever you have a vector Smart Object layer, you might as well leave it as a Smart Object as long as possible, but if you run into any difficulties or there are things you want to do that you can't do because it's not pixels, then you could convert it. Otherwise, just keep it as a vector Smart Object and keep your options open. Placing pixel-based elements into Adobe Illustrator. You can also place pixel-based objects into an Illustrator document as well. Just draw over a sketch or a logo. People often sketch logos and then clean them up using the tools in Illustrator. You can draw over a photo. There's also a live trace feature that you can use over photos or draw on images inside of Illustrator. But remember, as soon as you bring pixels into Illustrator, document size and resolution matter, so you have to start thinking about that when you set up the document. And inside of Illustrator, if you go to File, New, when you're making your document, you want to make sure, and I would pick RGB for a wider color gamut, and I would make it 300 pixels per inch, not 150 or 72, okay? In fact, you could just make all of your documents at 300 pixels per inch in Illustrator. It doesn't matter unless you have pixel-based images, but that way if you decide to add some or you just forget about it, then you already have proper resolution for print. And hit OK. And the 4 ways that I showed you to place objects into Photoshop, you can also do that with Illustrator. You can have both documents open and drag them over. Maybe that's the easiest way. You can also select and copy and paste. You can drag a file icon into your document. I'm hitting delete. Or you can go to File, Place, and place your document into Illustrator. Document setup. It's fine to bring pixel images into Illustrator while you're working, but I strongly suggest assembling your final project in Photoshop. Bring your Illustrator images into Photoshop ultimately because it's a lot more flexible, and since you're working with some pixels anyway, or mostly pixels, you'll have the most options in terms of manipulating and combining the vector and pixel-based images. So again, you'll want to set up a new blank document in Photoshop at proper size and resolution and just drag everything into it. Don't just open some image in Photoshop and start dragging stuff into it, because if you do, you'll be stuck with the size and the resolution that your image happens to be. Make a new document so you know everything is set up right, and then drag everything into it. So let's set up our new document together so it's ready for our project. We'll do File, New, and we'll choose US paper because at least it puts it in inches. And then let's make a 14-inch wide document and a 10-inch high document. And I don't mind if you change these slightly. For instance, if you want to make it bigger or you want to make it a different proportion, if you want to make it square, you can make it 14 by 14, but make it a fairly large size and make it 360 pixels per inch, which is what they like at the output center for printing. And then choose RGB color. And then under Advanced, we choose Adobe RGB. Hopefully you guys remember this from digital color class. Adobe RGB. So we have the proper resolution, the proper color mode, so we have the widest possible range of colors or gamut. And we hit OK. And there it is. So that's all there is to it. I'm looking forward to seeing some interesting and effective visual mashups.